As my father said, I've spent 18 years in Russia and returned in August of last year and am now living in Columbus. And the company that I work for here in the States is Hock International, and we do CMA review materials. And I know some of you have used our materials, some of you should be using our materials. And we are in the process of making videos for the CMA program, to have videos to help people go through the process. And as part of making the videos, this is Ron Horn behind us here who's doing the videoing. And when I told him that I was going to come down and make this presentation, we decided that he would come down and shoot it. And what we're going to do with it is we're going to post it on our website. If you would like to post it on your website, that's fine. And we're also going to use this with the IMA chapter that exists in Moscow, Russia, to make this available to them as well. And so we're going to take this video and hopefully get it into a few places that perhaps these meetings don't normally get to. But that's not the reason that I'm here today, is to talk about that. The topic today is CMA and education. And this is obviously a very broad topic because there's a lot of things that are connected to that. But I want to start kind of talking about how it is that I got here to talk about this. I spent 18 years in Russia immediately after graduation. I graduated in May of '94. In September of '94, I moved to Russia as an auditor. The last 16 years of my time in Russia has been spent in training in one form or another. The last 12 years have been spent teaching CMA. In the year 2000, I started a company, Hock Training. The first courses that we ran as a company were for CMA. And so I spent 12 years teaching CMA to candidates in Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, in various countries in that part of the world. Just kind of a statistic, when I started in Russia, when we ran our first course in Russia, there were a total of 5 CMAs in Russia. There were 4 Americans who were working in Russia, and 1 Russian gentleman who at that time had gone to London to take the 4 exams. And so he was the first Russian CMA. Since that time, we're up into the hundreds of CMAs. We run classes for both Part 1 and Part 2 3 times a year for each of the exam windows. And we have probably 60 to 80 people between those 2 groups. And so CMA is something that is in demand in Russia and has continued to grow in demand. We're here talking about education, or I'm here talking about education, and I know that I'm in education for a very strange reason. The reason I know that I'm in education is because anytime I have to fill out a form online about my company and what my company does, the best description, the best option that's usually available is education. We're not in consulting, we're not in accounting, we're not in auditing. What we are is in education. And so I know that I'm in education, but I'm not in traditional formal education in the way a lot of people think about education. My father's been a professor of accountancy for 35 years in a very formal way. My sister-in-law taught 4th grade. Okay, obviously different levels of the educational spectrum, but both part of that traditional formal educational structure that we have. That's not what I've been doing. I've been doing education that's a little bit outside of that structure, but still very important type of education. When I was putting this together, I was thinking about the different types of education that we come across, or different ways that we could classify education. Some of the education that we have is very structured and very formal, and some of the education that we have is a little bit more flexible, a little bit more free-flowing, depending on what it is that we're learning. Some of the education that we do is at university, and a lot of the education that we have is after university. Some of the education that we have is very technical, job-oriented to a specific skill or task that we need to accomplish. And some education that we have is what, at least in my experience, is called soft skills, which is not something that we're able to say this is exactly what I'm doing today, but presentation skills, interpersonal skills, and things like that. And I think we can agree that all of those types of education are needed for various forms, and it's important that we get all of them. So I wanted to try to look at what types of those forms of education CMA fits, or what is it that CMA provides. And I think we can agree that CMA is structured, very formalized as to what it is. It's done after university. and it's very technical or job oriented. The skills you're learning are skills that you do on a regular basis, you would like to do in your next job, or you know that somebody in your company is doing these things. So I want to talk about the structured, the after university, and the technical part. Structured. CMA is very, very structured, and it has to be, and the fact that it is very, very useful for us. There's a syllabus, and that syllabus tells us what is on the exam, and also from a training standpoint, just as importantly, what's not on the exam. We know where the box is drawn and where it is what it is that we need to know. And what this means is that everybody who's passed CMA has passed the same curriculum. And that's a little bit different than the way we talk about universities. When you go to a university, some universities are known, some universities are not known. I graduated from Miami. I have an accounting degree from Miami. Here, that's helpful. That's useful. In Russia, when I say that I graduated from Miami, everybody thinks I'm from Florida. And my university education doesn't mean what it means here. But CMA, with a structured formal syllabus, erases that difference between universities, because when somebody says they're a CMA, we know what they know, or at least we know what they know 70% of, because you may not know all of it. But we know what it is that they know, because everybody took the same exam. So a very structured syllabus is very, very good because it levels everything. It's a common curriculum that everybody knows what it is that we passed. The second element, CMA is after university. Well, yes and no. Oftentimes, I would say the vast majority of people are taking CMA after they finish university, after they get their degree. But this is something that is even more important, I think, outside the United States than it is inside the United States. In the United States, if you go into an accounting or finance career or job after university, chances are very, very strong that you have an accounting or finance degree, whether it's a bachelor's, master's, whatever, but your education is in that. Outside the United States, in my experience, a lot of people enter accounting or finance as a second career. 30, 35 years old, they didn't like what they were doing, they decided they wanted a job that makes money, and so you have people that are entering after university. And so CMA is not providing what it does here, where it kind of recaps what was studied at university, but it may be for some people the introduction to formal accounting education. Kind of as an aside, if you look at the qualifications in England, the UK qualifications, both the financial accounting qualifications and management accounting, and by this I'm talking about the Chartered Institute of England and Wales, ACCA and CMA, it's 15 exams, 17 exams. And what happened, or the reason for that, is historically in England people entered accounting without an accounting degree. And so the first exam is debits should equal credits. And for exams in the US that require an accounting degree, there's no need to have a test that starts with debits equal credits, because your bachelor's degree has hopefully demonstrated that you already know that element. And so these qualifications start earlier, or provide a different function in England. If you look at CMA, that debit equal credit part is now assumed knowledge in the CMA exam. It's not tested, but it's assumed that you already know that and are ready to apply that knowledge to other situations. So what we have with CMA is it's often done after university for different reasons. The third element of the CMA education is that it's very technical and job-oriented skills. And to some extent the answer to this is yes, I hope so, because if the skills you're learning are not technical to your job, there's really not much reason to make the investment to study. But I want to tell a story here, give an example. The skills that are learned at times even if you don't pass the exams. I had a student, a CMA student in Russia probably 10 years ago, and she took the accounting exam, the US GAAP exam at that time, and she failed. She came to class again, came every day to class, wonderful student, took it a second time and failed again. Came to class every time the third time, took it a third time and failed again. And to be honest, at some point you're beginning to wonder how many times you should continue an exam before you realize that maybe this isn't your calling in life. But I was talking to her after all of that, and she said to me, she said, "Brian, you know, I haven't passed the exams yet, but everybody at work has commented how much better I am at doing my job than I was before." And so even though she didn't pass, she was learning the skills that were applicable to the job, because that's what CMA was teaching. Now, to tell the whole story, her problem in passing the exam was not a knowledge problem, it was a language problem. Her English skills just weren't really there to be able to take the exam. So, I've said that CMA is structured, it's after university, and it's oriented towards the technical job skills. The good news for CMA, though, is that this isn't the full picture of the role that CMA plays in education. Because as I look at it, if this is all CMA played as a role in education, there's not much of a future for CMA. But I would argue that CMA is also flexible and changing. It is during university, and it is filled with what I'm going to call the non-job skills or soft skills. And it's these characteristics of CMA that are very, very important. So first of all, talking about the flexibility and the changingness of CMA. When I say that CMA is flexible, I don't mean that the answers A or B is acceptable and we're willing to be flexible in what is passing and not passing. That's not it. But what happens is, over time, the knowledge that people need on the job changes. And an exam has to change with it in order to remain relevant. And if we had anybody here, I'm sure we do, who passed the CMA exam a little while ago, some of the topics that are on the exam today may not have even existed as topics 15 or 20 years ago. IFRS, balanced scorecard, these are topics that on the exam 15 years ago didn't exist. Because, Sarbanes-Oxley, because 15 years ago, nobody knew to test it. There wasn't anything to test. And so the CMA exam does a very, very good job, I think, of staying current and staying relevant in terms of looking at what is needed in the real world today. Not what's needed academically, but what is needed in the real world. And so it stays flexible. One of the kind of interesting things, I learned a little while ago that my 4th grade son, an example of this, my 4th grade son is not learning cursive writing in school. They don't teach cursive anymore. They teach typing. Because as a child goes through education now, it's typing that you need to do and not writing in cursive or print. And when I was talking about this with somebody else, they made a point that schools used to teach calligraphy. And calligraphy was phased out, and I'm sure at that time people said, "Oh my goodness, how can we have these kids learning, graduating without having calligraphy skills?" Well, things change, and this is what's changing as well. Another example, CFM. CFM did exist. Okay, and some of you who are new to CMA may be saying, "Well, CFM, what's he talking about?" Well, there was a CFM exam that has kind of been folded into the CMA exam as what is needed is changed. So the CMA exam is fortunately very, very flexible and changes as it needs to. Now, for those of you who took the exam before there was IFRS and balanced scorecard and Sarbanes-Oxley, the good news is continuing professional education. Even if you passed the exam 20 years ago, presumably you have been doing 40 hours of continuing education every year, and those skills have been kind of included in that in some way to stay current with what is changing in the profession. The second element here about the university education and whether CMA is after university or during university, I'm going to perhaps give a slightly different perspective on the university education than we have here in the States. I believe that CMA is something that should be started at the university level. and emphasized at the university level. Now, perhaps not the exams themselves, but I believe that every university student, no matter what they are studying, should take a course that covers cost accounting, budgeting, and some semblance of how it is that money works and how it is that the store determines that this is the price they're going to charge you for whatever it is that you're buying. For students who are studying accounting, studying finance, to me, CMA is a wonderful, wonderful thing to be done at university. It creates a huge advantage when trying to get a job. There's a lot of people that have a bachelor's degree or master's degree in accountancy, but somebody who's passed a certification has demonstrated a commitment to something more than just going to class and taking the final exam and hoping they pass and all of that. But there's another element to the role that CMA and the IMA can play in the university education. And this is a role that's not really here in the US, but in developing economies where the university curriculum hasn't fully developed like it needs to. In Russia, 20 years ago, we didn't have IFRS. There wasn't the business that takes place like it does now. There was a very centralized command economy. And nobody cared what profit or loss was because there wasn't a concept of profit or loss. Universities weren't generating students that had these skills. It was a very much compliance-oriented career. And bookkeepers were not a very prestigious profession because it was just counting whatever it is that the company was doing. And so as universities and developing economies have to create an accounting curriculum, the curriculum that exists within CMA is in essence a guide as to what it is that a university education should include. Because these are the skills that the graduates are going to need when they go out into the workforce. And sometimes when I present this, people say, well, but Brian, those skills are needed in a different environment. Here in Russia, we need different skills. We don't need the same skills that are needed in Ohio. And my answer to that is, when you go to work for Procter & Gamble in Russia, you're working for Procter & Gamble. And the people in Procter & Gamble are going to expect the same accounting out of Procter & Gamble in Russia as they expect out of Procter & Gamble from Cincinnati or any other place in the world. And so the syllabus is relevant in the global economy that we have today. Now the third element of education that's a little bit different is soft skills. And some of you may be sitting there wondering how it is that I'm going to convince you that the CMA provides soft skills training. But what I'm going to have to do here to do that is I'm going to expand the definition of soft skills a little bit. Usually soft skills, as I said, are presentation skills and meeting skills and negotiation skills and things that are away from the debits and credits and the numbers of accounting. But what I'm going to do with the definition of soft skills is I'm going to expand it to include anything that is not relevant to the job you do on a day-to-day basis. Because from a controlling standpoint or a cost control standpoint in a company, if you go up the ladder to whoever has to approve training, and you say, I would like this training in capital budgeting. And the person says, do you do capital budgeting? No, I don't. But it would be interesting. The person's going to say, well, I agree that capital budgeting training would be interesting, but it would be better for the person who actually does the capital budgeting. Why should we train you to do something you don't do? And so if we make soft skills to include skill sets that you don't use on a day-to-day basis, in my opinion, CMA is wonderful. The way I see CMA and the way I talk about it with people is that CMA does a wonderful, wonderful job of providing information and knowledge about how a business operates. From planning and budgeting, short-term decision-making, long-term decision-making, short-term working capital management, long-term financing, risk management, the internal control environment. This is in CMA. And so for me, in the world that we're moving to where jobs are starting to be a little bit less of in a specific silo, but you're needing to have some connection with the other parts of the business, CMA does that wonderfully well. And CMA, for me, is the ideal qualification for an entrepreneur. Somebody who wants to start their own business has to study the things that are in CMA. Because when you start your own business, as I know, your roles include budgeting and planning and risk assessment and short-term decision making and financing questions and pricing questions and how much does it cost us to produce our product. All of those things are decisions that an entrepreneur has to make. And so for somebody who wants to start their own business, somebody who's working in a company where the jobs are starting to become a little bit more entrepreneurial, large companies are starting to say, we've lost that spark and we need to start giving people more of a power to make decisions and to do things. Having that connection between what you do here in your department and what happens in the rest of the business is critical. And so the skills that CMA teaches that are outside of your specific job today are important, because it might be your job tomorrow, and if you start your own business, everything that's in CMA is going to be in your job description. And so the way I see it is that all of those elements of education that I listed at the beginning, formal, not formal, structured, after university, during university, job-oriented skills and soft skills, it's all there in CMA. And these are skills that people are going to need and a type of education that people are going to need. Now there's one other kind of perspective on this that I want to talk about and share. And that is that a lot of what I said about CMA is applicable to other exams as well. Not necessarily about entrepreneurs, but in terms of the skills that are learned. It's applicable elsewhere in other exams as well. And so I want to spend a minute and talk about this issue of a professional certification, because that's what CMA is. It is a professional certification. And I want to talk about what it is that professional certification means. There's two words. It's all very short. Two words, professional certification. We'll start with the second word because it's a little bit easier. Certification. If you have certification, it means you've done something. And if we go back to childhood and remember when we got certificates, it was often a certification of achievement or certificate of achievement, certification or certificate of completion or something. And so if you have a professional certification, what that means is somewhere, either on your wall or somewhere else, you have a certificate that says you passed this qualification, you received this designation, whatever the case may be. So it certifies what it is that you have done. So that's relatively straightforward. It's the first word of professional that I think we need to spend a little time looking at in CMA's role in this. The first question is, what's the definition of professional? If we were to look at the Olympics, the definition of a professional is somebody who is paid to participate in whatever sport or skill they're in the Olympics in. So if you get paid to play basketball, you're a professional basketball player. If you don't get paid at university, you're not a professional. Now, if we were to take that same definition into accounting, it means that once you get your first job as an accountant and you get your first paycheck, it means that you are a professional accountant. I don't agree with that. I think it is very possible for somebody to be a professional accountant. Wait, I'm sorry. I didn't set this up right. If you have a professional certification, it doesn't mean that you are a professional. Okay? There are people that don't have a certification who are professional accountants, and there are people who have a certification who are not professional accountants. And so the question then becomes, what is a professional? In my years training in Russia, I kind of got an interesting perspective, I think, of how it is that a profession develops and what is meant by somebody being a professional and part of a profession. 15 years ago in Russia, when I would talk to my students about what they did, they were in what I call a job stage. They had a job. They worked for this company, and this is what they did. And you ask them, what does your company do? Oh, I don't know. I'm in accounts receivable, this is what I do. And I'd say, what are you going to do 5 years from now, 10 years from now? This is my company, this is my job, this is what I do. And they had a job, and they went to their job, and they got paid, and everybody was happy. And what I say at this stage when somebody has a job is that their focus is downward. They are focusing on themselves and at this moment in time. This is who I am. This is my job. This is what I do. Essentially, this is my business card. Well, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, a shift started to take place. And the way I explain it is that people stopped having jobs and started having a career. Where when you ask what they did, they would say what they did. This is my job, this is where I work. But then they would add, but what I really want to do is this. What I want to be next is I want to have this position. I want to get a job in that company. And what was happening is people were starting to still be focused on themselves, but they were starting to look into the future. They were starting to say, this is what I want to be. I'm not happy. I'm not going to be happy doing the same thing that I'm doing right now until I retire. And as soon as people started to say, that's what I want to do next, they started to ask themselves the question, how am I going to accomplish that? How am I going to get from here today to there 2 years from now, 5 years from now, whatever? And oftentimes, the reason I was talking to these people is because they determined that a professional certification was part of that process. I want to get a job with Procter & Gamble. But to get a job with Procter & Gamble, I need to have a certification. Or having a certification will be greatly beneficial in getting that job that I want in the future with Procter & Gamble. And so the certification, CMA's role, is part of a transformation of how people think from a job to a career. But when we're talking about a career, when a person's talking about a career, their focus is now outward, into the future. But it's still only about themselves. It's still only about me and what I want to do and where I want to be. But at least it's now up and not down. There's another stage that comes after a career, which is where we want to be, and that is the stage of being a professional. And what happened 5 years ago is I started to talk with the IMA about starting a chapter in Russia. And I don't know how many years ago, at that time the president of the IMA came to Russia. We had a meeting, we had 70 people there. And at that time I said to everybody, I said, I'll help start the IMA chapter, but I won't do it myself. I was the person that every CMA candidate in Russia knew because I had taught them, and everybody wanted me to start the chapter. But I said, I can't start the chapter, because if I start the chapter, it's just a chapter of my students. And that's not what the IMA is hoping to create, I hope. The IMA should be creating an organization for professional accountants, whether or not you've taken CMA. Because there's a lot of professional accountants who haven't taken CMA who should be part of the IMA. And so after that, I said, I'll start, but what we need is we need to find 5 people that are willing to lead it. I'll support it, but I'm not going to lead it myself. And it didn't happen. The chapter didn't happen. We got a couple of people who were interested, but nobody was willing to pick up the ball and say, this is important. This is what somebody here needs to do. Well, the good news is that 2 years ago, a chapter did start. And a group of people did take that leadership role. They created the executive committee. They created the positions. They did the advertising, and they got the people. And it's a little bit like this chapter. Monthly meetings. There's a speaker. There's no dinner yet. Maybe that's in the future. But it's a meeting of professionals. And what makes it, in my mind, the difference between a career and a profession is that a professional has an understanding that their career does not operate, does not happen in isolation from everybody else. And it's an understanding that This is something bigger than just me. And when you talk to a professional, the answer to who are you or what do you do is, I'm an accountant. Now, at this point in time, this is who I work for. But I have an association to what it is that I do and other people who do the same thing, in addition to my association with my job. And this is what's happened in Russia. From 15 years ago, everybody had a job, and people weren't thinking to the future. They weren't thinking about the next job or what it is they wanted to do. There is now an IMA chapter. And people understand that the value of being a CMA, the value of being an IMA chapter member, rests with all of us. Because we're all connected. If I'm a CMA and I meet somebody and they know I'm a CMA, they have an impression about me. And by default, that impression about me becomes their impression about CMAs. It becomes their impression about somebody who's a member of the IMA. And so when you meet that person, you are hoping that I made a good impression. Because when you meet that person and you say, I'm a CMA, oh, I already met a CMA. Yeah, I know what you guys are like. I didn't like Brian. We're connected to each other. And the value of my being a CMA is contingent on the value that we all bring to the table. And this is what we are here. We're here because we're a professional. Certified or not, we're a professional. And so if I go back to this professional certification, CMA is a professional certification. Yes, there's a certification that goes with it. There's a certificate that goes on your wall. But if it's a professional certification, there's more than just passing the exam to being a professional accountant. It's the commitment to the profession. It's a commitment to the other members of that profession, because it all connects back to each other. What's the role of CMA in all of this? Well, as I started at the beginning, I think there's a lot of things that CMA does from an education standpoint. Some of the ones that I presented tonight, maybe not things that you had thought of before. And I understand that some may be more or less relevant to a particular environment. But as I see it, CMA in education is a very, very important and critical part to being an accountant, being a management accountant, being a finance professional. And this is why we're here.